This is the Grand Union Canal. It's 137 miles long and it has 158 locks. A beautiful canal. Who doesn't like walking along the towpath on a beautiful day, watching the wildlife, feeding the ducks? These canals were a big part of the working day life. The UK was the first country to develop a nationwide network. The canals were built to enable goods like coal to be transported across the country. The construction of the canal and the railway was the biggest civil project ever undertaken in this country. Canal workers had a very hard life living and working on the canal boats. Inside of the boat was very crammed and there could be up to 6 children on board. So who built the canals? The men that built the canals were known as navvies, from the word navigation, which the canals were originally called. These men were strong men and they worked very hard. It took a year to make a navvy and then they were expected to move 20 tonnes of earth a day. Here we see a navvy with such a full wheelbarrow. How many of us these days could move that once, let alone time after time after time? The men would fill wheelbarrows right to the top, and then they would have this almighty task of dragging this heavy load up these sheer slopes. It was such a spectacle that people would come in their finery and stand by watching these men slave away hour after hour each day. The work was mainly done by hand, using picks, shovels and dynamite. There was no health and safety, so death and injury was an everyday thing. The conditions were absolutely appalling. Wet, dirty, horrible conditions. The ages of the workers was from under 10 years old right up to men in their 60s and 70s. The work was very, very hard indeed, and they worked long, long hours. Because of the physical hard work, the navvies ate approximately 8,000 calories a day, half of which was bread. They also consumed between 6 and 8 pints of beer a day, which was relatively weak, but a lot safer than drinking the water. The average guy at the time was about 5'6", but a lot of the navvies were 6 foot tall and 15 stone, and their wages were 5 times that of a farm worker. Among the men that worked on the canals were Irishmen that had come from Ireland. They had to leave their country because of the famine, and they took up work along with our men in this country. The navvies lived along the canals in shanties and wooden huts. Some were single men that shared with lots of other men, but others were family men and they dragged their families along the canals with them. Being a navvy was like joining a gang. They become members of groups. They worked hard and they drank even harder. When they had the use of the heavy machinery to dig out the earth, it was still hard manual labour and thirsty work. This is the Bridgewater Arms, named after the Duke of Bridgewater. The navvies were even paid their wages in beer. This is Asbridge House. The Duke of Bridgewater used to live here. What is his connection to the canal? Francis Egerton was the third Duke of Bridgewater. Francis was a dull-witted boy and sickly lad, mostly left to the company of the servants. When his brother John died of consumption, he inherited the title and in 1748 became the third Duke of Bridgewater, aged only 12. His mother did not care for him and on the grounds of diminished intellect sought to have his inheritance set aside. He proved her wrong, and after a smattering of education and a European tour, Francis emerged himself to develop his estates and businesses adventures in the northwest of England. This is Asridge in Hertfordshire, and behind me is the monument dedicated to the Duke of Bridgewater. The Duke of Bridgewater wanted to improve the transport of the coal from his coal mines. He commissioned the canal to be built from Worsley to Manchester. The Duke of Bridgewater was the man of wealth and influence. He had the money to sponsor Acts of Parliament and several subsequent acts to extend the canal further. So he was able to persuade Parliament to pass the laws he needed. The canal was opened in 1761. It was considered to be the first true canal in England. It was 41 miles long and there are no locks. Huge profits could be made, and the Duke made a large profit. The price of coal dropped dramatically, and he became known as the Canal Duke. This wonderful map of the canal covers the whole wall in the Bridgewater Arms. There was 4,000 miles of canals and there was 23,000 miles of railways in under a century. The Duke appointed James Brindley, a millwright, as his consultant engineer. Brindley was poorly educated. He had gained a reputation for finding solutions to problems. He went on to be Britain's most famous canal engineer and to build many miles of canal and long tunnels. James went on to work with his estate manager, John Gilbert. These two men were a very important part of building the canal. In 1762, Brindley demonstrated his technique for keeping the water in the canal to Member of Parliament. A mixture of clay and loam, which is soil, and water was made into smooth paste. This was used to line the bottom of the canal. The mixture in layers was effectively watertight. James Brindley supplied the canal with wastewater from the coal mines, which drained through special tunnels. He made the canal run on a level all the way. However, he had to build an aqueduct over a river, an astonishing achievement in those days. At its peak of construction in the 1840s, the labourers were 250,000 men working to build the canals. There were female navvies. This is Big Rachel. She was 6'4" tall and about 17 stone. Female navvies worked on the canals, the railways, the shipyards, and in World War I, they also took over the men's work. Elizabeth Garnett was the founder of the Navvy Mission Society and a leading force in helping the navvies with soup kitchens, libraries to enable education and improve their lives. The building of the canals and railways was a mammoth task that the navvies achieved. You will often find that the railways are not far from the canal. Rattle his bones over stones. He's only a navvy who nobody owns. Elizabeth Garnett, who said of them, "Certainly no men in all the world so improve their country as navvies do England. Their work will last for ages and, if the world remains so long, people will come from hundreds of years hence to look at and to wonder at what they have done." We have, and we do. The oldest canal is the Fossdyke navigation built by the Romans in AD 120. I hope you've enjoyed this episode dedicated to the navvies that built these wonderful canals that we still enjoy today, and after all this time they are still very important to us.